So in part two of this series of screencasts, we looked at climate change and some of the impacts of climate change. And I want to make the point. This is kind of one of the big things about science. In science, you have to be able to make predictions based on your model, and if your predictions come true, then that leads more support for your model. So, for example, Charles Darwin came up with this idea of natural selection, and he said, if I'm right, we should see more transition fossils. And later on, we did. If I'm right, then if we ever discover the genetic material, we should be able to track these evolutionary changes uh, through changes in DNA sequences. And we did. So prediction is important in science. And I want to point out that scientists made predictions about climate change probably about, I think, 50 years ago, maybe even 60 years ago. Scientists identified this as a problem decades ago, and they said, if we don't act, then we will see. And the things they identified, rising temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, they predicted increases in storms and intense storms, basically all of it. In fact, when I started my career teaching about 20 years ago, um, this unit, my notes on this unit were all phrased in the future tense. If we don't act, then we will see this, then we will see that. Now I'm using the present tense because we're actually seeing these changes happening. We are seeing species go extinct and their distribution being altered. We are seeing the increase in wildfires. We are seeing the increase in precipitation patterns in different parts of the world. We are seeing Greenland melting. We are seeing sea levels rising. We are seeing changes in temperature. Everything that has been predicted for decades, we're now seeing. And so again, that lends credibility to the science behind this idea. So with the ozone layer, we kind of said, all right, we have a problem, so let's get together and address this problem. And guess what? The solution to climate change, well, it's kind of simple. You just have to reduce the emissions of these greenhouse gases, most notably carbon dioxide. The dilemma, though, is that much of our economy is really dependent on carbon dioxide because we need fossil fuels for energy. And so because of that, it makes reducing it much more difficult. Well, we tried. In 2005, nations met in Kyoto, Japan this time, and they met to discuss voluntary reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. And all the nations highlighted in green signed. The ones highlighted in brown, you'll notice, are the nations that did not sign this agreement. And the United States was one of those nations. And keep in mind this little statistic in 2005, we were right about there in terms of our use of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. And the reason why we didn't sign was because the economic impact would be high, and it was not. We were treated differently than nations like China, which were considered developing at the time, and so it felt unfair that it would kind of hit the United States harder than developing nations like China. So it was not signed by the United States as a result. Well, in 2015. Another attempt was made to make an international agreement, and this was done in Paris. It was called the Paris Accords, and again, the nations met to try and develop voluntary reductions in emissions, and the hope was to prevent global temperatures from exceeding 2 degrees, and hopefully to reduce the increase to 1.5 degrees. You may remember 2 degrees was that number where the Greenland ice sheet is pretty much doomed to melt. And this time, all the countries in orange signed. So the United States signed at that time. But then in 2017, the US announced its intention to withdraw. Now, unfortunately, based on the agreement, well, fortunately or unfortunately, based on the agreement, the United States could not legally withdraw until 2020 on the day after the presidential election. And I think that was put in there on purpose. And so basically we are technically in the Paris Accords as we speak, And the day after this upcoming presidential election is when it will be decided if we are going to remain in the Paris Accords or not remain in the Paris Accords. So that's kind of the status of where we are at with climate change. And even though nationally we've sort of struggled, local governments and states have tried to do things to reduce climate change as well. So, if you're interested, here's some additional resources. I kind of like this one, Skeptical Scientists, Our Scientific Responses to Common Misconceptions About Climate Change. And so feel free to check these out or not as you wish. The key theme, though, as we look throughout this whole unit, is that ecosystems are systems. And so altering one part of the system affects other parts. And right now, humans are impacting lots of these systems, and problems are arising as a result. So that actually concludes Unit 8 on ecology and actually the year. So I wanted to pause just for a moment to just kind of take a moment to look back at where we have been. Ladies and gentlemen, we began this journey of AP Biology looking at the humble atom. And we looked at atoms and molecules, and we built those molecules up into very complex things called lipids and carbohydrates and proteins. And we looked at kind of the biochemistry of life. Um, we then use the lipids and carbohydrates and proteins to build a cell. And we looked at all the different parts of the cell. And then we started to zoom in on different aspects of the cell. We zoomed in on the mitochondria and the chloroplast to understand how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are used to generate energy. We zoomed in on the nucleus to better understand DNA and how heredity works. We looked at heredity from the context of the cell cycle and making copies of cells, passing traits on, and then we also looked at a molecular level with just the structure of DNA. And then we even took our knowledge of DNA and molecular genetics and used it to do some kind of fancy technology kinds of things with gel electrophoresis, and we talked about recombinant DNA and all sorts of other things. At that point, we kind of zoomed out a little bit and we looked at how changes in those gene frequencies can result in evolution. And we looked at how evolution works and how populations change over time, and then sort of looked at the timeline of history of life on Earth to see just how much it has changed. And then we closed our year by looking at ecology and how, energy and materials are sort of circulating through living things throughout this planet, and just looking at the interactions between all these living things, concluding with the kind of impact that humans are having. So along the way, we hope that you leave with a strong sense for how good science is done. For something to count as science, the questions must be testable, conclusions have to be based on data, ideas have to change as new information is found, and you must be able to make predictions about what's coming. I hope you leave with a little bit of an inoculation against fake news. There's a lot of efforts these days to manipulate you and to make you believe different things on both sides of the political spectrum. And so I hope that you've got some critical thinking skills that can kind of protect you from misleading information and people trying to manipulate your thinking. And then I hope I've given you a sense to sort of understand and hopefully help combat future challenges. So, obviously climate change is a pretty significant one. The planet is definitely hurting, and there's much work to be done to try and dial back some of the impacts that humans are having. Genetic engineering, for good or ill, is definitely going to have an impact on your lives in the future, and I hope I've given you the tools to understand that. Exercise and fitness, just understanding how the body works, can help you make healthy choices and lead a happy and healthy life. And then just a general appreciation for nature. I hope you can kind of go outside and just look at things, look at insects and wonder, what are they doing and why are they doing that? Look at trees and just kind of marvel at all the incredible processes that are happening to keep that tree going. Look at how animals and plants interact with each other to create this glorious planet, and just get a little better appreciation for just how incredible life on Earth is. So congratulations, ladies and gentlemen. You've made it through AP Biology. And we'd like to thank you for hanging in there with us, and we hope you enjoyed the course. Thanks.